Clara Thompson held the microphone with both hands, the cold sweat on her palms a sharp contrast to the composed stillness she projected outward. The stage lights found her face and held it, and hundreds of pairs of eyes settled on her with the specific quality of attention that contains judgment, dressed up as curiosity. She had felt this before. She knew its texture. "Tell me something," she said, her voice carrying the calm of a poker player who knows exactly what they're holding. "How many times have you seen a black woman standing on a stage like this one?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Some people looked away. Others pressed their lips into careful lines. Clara let it breathe. "It's rare, isn't it?" She paused, letting the word settle. And rarity in this world tends to be mistaken for something other than what it is. For luck, for exception, for something that won't last. She waited one more beat. "But I'm not an exception. I am a trend. And this particular trend is only going to grow." The applause that came was uneven, some of it genuine, some of it the obligatory kind that people produce when they aren't sure what else to do, and Clara received it all the same way, with a nod and a smile that gave nothing away. As she walked off the stage, her mind moved backward through time with the involuntary ease of someone who has learned that the past is always present whether you invite it or not. Detroit, a house with windows that let in more cold than light, and a roof that had its own relationship with rain. She had grown up understanding scarcity, not as an abstraction, but as the specific texture of daily life. The particular silence of a house where worrying about money was so constant it had stopped sounding like worry and started sounding like background noise. What she also grew up understanding was that the way out was through the mind. So she read and studied and imagined, and by the time she was 17, she had a full scholarship to one of the most competitive computer science programs in the country. No one in her neighborhood talked about it the way it deserved to be talked about. At the university, the talking took a different form. "You're only here because of a quota." She heard this in so many variations, delivered with so many different tones, the casual cruelty of it, the way people said it as though it were simply an observation and not a weapon. She responded the way she always responded, which was by being undeniable, by being better than good, by making her work impossible to dismiss, even by people who were actively trying to dismiss it. By the time she graduated, she had an idea that had been developing quietly for years. A company that would sit at the intersection of technological innovation and sustainability. That was how Thompson Innovations had come into being, not from capital or connections or family history in the industry. From the specific determination of someone who has been told repeatedly that they don't belong somewhere and has decided that belonging is something you create, not something you're granted. That was years ago. Now she ran one of the most innovative technology companies in the sector, and her place at the top was still, on a daily basis, questioned. After the speech, the room rearranged itself around her. Investors with agendas, journalists with angles, the category of person who simply wanted proximity to success in case some of it was transferable. Jack Williams found her through the crowd with the ease of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by rooms like this one. White, blonde, and carrying the casual authority of a man who had never had a fight to be taken seriously in a corporate environment. He was, as he had always been, the face that many people expected to see at the front of her company. He had spent years making it clear, publicly and consistently, that he was not the person running things. "You know how to clear a room of comfortable silence," he said, reaching her. "Someone should. There's someone who wants to meet you." He tilted his head toward a figure approaching from the left, silver-haired, expensively suited, carrying the particular smile of a man who has practiced appearing respectful while feeling the opposite. He shook her hand with the correct pressure and the wrong energy. "Miss Thompson, your presentation was genuinely impressive." "Thank you. It must be quite challenging," he continued, in the tone of someone about to say something they believe is helpful, "for a woman, especially a woman in your position, to stand out the way you have. A real achievement." A pause. "Have you ever considered bringing on someone with more traditional experience to share the leadership? Someone who could take some of the weight off?" There it was. The suggestion that her success required an explanation, and that the explanation was that she must be carrying a burden she wasn't equipped for. Clara looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has heard this in 50 different forms. With respect, she said, "Who do you think is leading right now?" He laughed, wrong-footed, and composed himself into something that resembled grace. Of course. Just a thought. What you've built is truly remarkable." She nodded once and watched him find somewhere else to be. Jack appeared at her shoulder. "Nicely done." Same conversation. Different suit. She looked around the room, at the smiling faces and the champagne glasses and the industry of people networking their way through an evening, and felt the familiar weight settle. They applauded her. Many of them were waiting for her to fail. These two things existed simultaneously without contradiction, and she had long since stopped being surprised by that. She hadn't come here to be applauded. She had come because this was what the work looked like from the outside, and the work was what mattered. Clara had a gift for identifying what needed to happen next. 3 weeks later, the next thing arrived in the form of an invitation on her screen, an email with the unmistakable formality of something significant. "Dear Ms. Clara Thompson, we are pleased to invite you to present at this year's Global Tech Summit. Thompson Innovations has been selected as a finalist for the Sustainable Solutions contract with Green Core Technologies, valued in the billions. Your presentation will be broadcast globally." She sat with the email for a moment, felt the specific quality of opportunity that changes things, not just financially, though the number was extraordinary, but in terms of what it would mean for the story people told about her company. About her. She also felt, underneath the excitement, the familiar preparation for opposition, because she had learned that achievement and attack arrived together, reliably, in her experience. She called Jack in. He read the invitation and looked up with the complicated expression of someone who is happy and worried simultaneously. "This is the kind of deal that changes careers permanently," he said. "The competition is going to be brutal, and some of it isn't going to be clean. I've already heard things." "What kind of things?" He closed the office door. "Rumors that you're on the finalist list because of diversity pressure. Doubt being manufactured about your technical capabilities." He looked at her directly. "They're doing it on purpose, Clara, and they're doing it before you've even walked into the room." She nodded slowly. None of this was new. The specific cruelty of it never became familiar, but its existence was something she had stopped being surprised by. "Let them talk," she said. "What I present on that stage will speak louder than anything they can manufacture in the background. Just be careful. They're looking for anything." She knew he was right. She spent the following weeks building a presentation that was more than competitive. It was, she knew objectively, the best work of her career, detailed, visionary, grounded in data that was irrefutable and animated by a genuine understanding of where the intersection of sustainability and artificial intelligence was heading. She worked long hours with a team that believed in what they were building and showed it in the quality of their output. The morning of the Global Tech Summit had the particular quality of mornings that you know, even as they're happening, that you'll remember. Clara stood in front of the backstage mirror and looked at her reflection, composed, contained, carrying the weight of what was about to happen and not visibly. She had spent years learning to wear confidence the way other people wore coats. But something about that morning felt different, and she couldn't locate precisely where the difference lived. The next presenter will be Clara Thompson, CEO of Thompson Innovations. She walked on with the posture of someone who belongs on a stage, because she did. The lights were blinding in the particular way of stages that were built to illuminate rather than to flatter. Around the edges of the room, she caught the sound of whispers, low, casual, carrying the lazy cruelty of assumptions presented as observations. That's not why she's on a list. You know how these things work. Clara exhaled once, found the stillness inside the noise, and began. The future of sustainable technology depends on bold solutions and the courage to pursue them. She moved through the presentation with a fluency that was the product of genuine mastery. Graphs that told coherent stories. Data that built into arguments. A vision for what the integration of AI and sustainability could produce that was specific enough to be credible and expansive enough to be compelling. She watched the audience lean forward incrementally, the physical language of people being convinced by something, and for a moment she believed the room was with her. Then a voice cut across everything. "Excuse me, Miss Thompson." The tone was pleasant in the way of something designed to wound. "This all sounds quite impressive in theory." She stopped. The room shifted. Richard Hale stood from the front row with the unhurried ease of a man who has decided the room belongs to him. He was the head of one of her largest competitors, and he had the specific confidence of someone who has spent decades being accommodated. "We're here to talk about real business," he continued, moving slightly into space as though pacing a room he owned. "And real business needs more than compelling narratives. It needs numbers." He smiled, which raises a question everyone in this room is probably thinking, but no one has said directly. He paused for effect. Was Thompson Innovations selected for this stage on merit? Or are we looking at the reflection of those diversity policies that have become so fashionable lately? The air in the room changed. Clara felt it physically, a compression, a sudden absence of oxygen. She looked out at the audience. Some faces showed shock. Others showed the careful blankness of people who are not going to intervene. No one in the room moved to stop this. No one stood up. The hundreds of eyes that had been watching her presentation were now watching something else, watching to see what she would do with the target that had just been painted on her. "You see," Hale continued, the smile still comfortable on his face, "we all know Thompson Innovations has been generating attention. But would we be listening to this presentation if the presenter weren't at the top of a very fashionable inclusion list?" He knew exactly what he had done. He had taken everything she had built and reframed it as something she had been given, in front of a global audience, on the stage that should have been the moment her work was recognized for what it was. Clara stood very still. She wanted to respond with the full weight of everything she knew about the work she had done and the path she had traveled to reach this room. She wanted to dismantle his argument with the precision it deserved. What she understood, in the moment between his words and her response, was that every possible answer would be read through the filter of what he had just established. If she were impassioned, she was defensive. If she were calm, she was agreeing. He had constructed the question so that there was no clean way out of it. She spoke anyway. "With respect, Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "The numbers you're asking about speak for themselves. What Thompson Innovations has achieved is the result of a clear vision and the work required to execute it. If being different from what this industry expects is a crime, I'll wear that designation without apology." She said it with strength. She felt the vulnerability underneath it, and she held both at once, which was something she had been doing for her entire career. The applause that came at the end of the presentation was polite, measured, the kind that keeps its hands together for exactly as long as courtesy requires, and then stops. Clara stepped off the stage and walked through the hall without meeting anyone's eyes. And in the backstage corridor, she let herself stop for the first time in 40 minutes and feel the full impact of what had just occurred. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the surface of a table and breathed. The doubt arrived before she could stop it. The specific poison of it, the question she had been fighting off her entire career, suddenly wearing the face of a man with a microphone and an audience of hundreds. What if he was right? What if everything she had built was still being seen as something other than what it was? The voice that answered was quieter but firmer than the doubt. "You are here because you are the best. They are afraid of what you represent." She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She walked out. The drive home unwound in a blur of city lights and tangled thought. She sat in the back of the car and looked at the window and felt the gap between what the evening should have been and what it had become. The moment that was supposed to consolidate everything she had worked for had instead become the moment that revealed, in front of a global audience, exactly what she was still fighting against. In her apartment, the city continued below the window with its indifferent energy, and Clara sat on the couch and looked at nothing for a while. Then she opened her phone. Social media was already processing the evening. Some responses praised the composure of her reply. Others parsed Hale's question as though it deserved parsing. One comment she almost scrolled past stopped her. Richard Hale said what everyone was already thinking, but no one had the guts to say out loud. This is what happens when inclusion is forced. The people who actually deserve these positions don't get them. She set the phone face down on the cushion beside her. Jack called. She knew he would. Clara, what happened out there was orchestrated. Don't let it pull you under. It's hard not to feel it, she said. Whatever I do, whatever I build, it's still being read as something that needs to be explained by something other than the work. These people are playing this way because you're a threat. The Green Core contract represents a level of visibility and financial power that would change what people see when they see you and your company. They're trying to prevent that. I know you're right. So what's the next move? Clara leaned her head against the back of the couch and looked at the ceiling. I don't know yet, but it won't be nothing. The following week confirmed that the damage had been calibrated. Investors who had been engaged began asking questions that were, in their architecture, the questions of people who had already absorbed a doubt someone else had planted. Emails arrived with the particular subtext of professional caution that means someone is reconsidering something. Jack brought news that Green Core was wavering. Not officially, not in writing, but in the way that institutional decisions waver when the wrong kind of noise gets loud enough. Years of work, Clara said, standing at the window of her office. And someone with a microphone and 30 seconds of public access can put a question mark against all of it. Then we change the question, Jack said. We don't defend. We go on offense. We make so much noise of our own that it becomes inaudible. She turned. I've been thinking the same thing. But not just noise. Something real. Something that does what he tried to do, but in the other direction. That exposes the actual structure, not just the incident. She spent 3 days working through it. She talked to lawyers and advisors and people who had navigated similar situations in different industries. She mapped the landscape of what was possible. And then, on a Thursday morning when the city was still gray with early light, the thing that changed the landscape arrived in Jack's hands. He came in her office and set his laptop on her desk. On the screen was a screenshot of an internal email from Hale's communications team, circulating on social media after having been leaked by a source the journalist declined to name. Clara read it once. Then again. The strategy is clear. Discredit Thompson at the conference. The inclusion narrative has worked in our favor. If public opinion continues to question her competence, we can eliminate any real chance she has of securing the Green Core contract. Continue pushing the forced diversity narrative and prepare for any public response from her. She sat back in her chair. She felt the relief of being right. Not the pleasant kind, but the kind that arrives when the thing you suspected turns out to be true and the knowledge doesn't actually feel good. What she had lived through hadn't been the normal cruelty of competition. It had been engineered, planned. There were people in a room somewhere who had decided that the way to handle her was to make the world believe she didn't deserve to be in that room. How widely has this been seen? She asked. It's moving fast. The response is divided. Some people are furious. Others are treating it as standard competitive practice. Standard competitive practice, she repeated. She closed the laptop gently. All right, we're going to use this, not just to defend ourselves. We're going to use it to open up a conversation about what this actually is, about what the industry looks like when you pull back the surface. She called the meeting that evening. Her legal team, her communications advisors, the core executive group that had been with her through every phase of building the company. The conference room was tense with the awareness of what was at stake. Clara didn't open with explanation. She opened the laptop and displayed the email on the room's main screen. She let everyone read it and absorb it. This isn't a business dispute, she said. This is a smear campaign. It was designed and executed deliberately, using prejudice as a business tool. And we're not going to respond to it the way they expect us to, defensively, quietly, managing it until it fades. We're going to bring it into the open completely. One of the lawyers spoke carefully. Defamation action is possible, but the timeline is long and the immediate impact would be minimal. I know. That's not the primary strategy. Clara looked around the table. We hold a press conference. We lay out everything. The email, the context, the pattern. And we don't frame it as a story about what happened to Thompson Innovations. We frame it as a story about what happens to companies led by people who don't fit the expected profile of leadership in this industry, because that story doesn't belong only to me. She watched the room absorb this. Some faces showed the particular calculation of people assessing risk. Others showed something simpler and more immediate. This will generate retaliation, she continued. I know that. They won't sit still. But if we stay quiet, we're allowing the narrative they built to stand. And the next time someone in my position stands on a stage, it'll happen to them too. We have an opportunity to make this a conversation that doesn't go away. Jack looked at her steadily. Then, let's have the conversation. The press conference was held on a Tuesday afternoon. The room filled with journalists and cameras and the specific crackling energy of an event where people sense something significant is about to happen. Clara stood behind the podium and felt, underneath the nerves, the particular stillness of someone who has decided. Over the past weeks, she began, Thomson Innovations has been the target of a coordinated campaign to undermine our credibility and our standing as a legitimate competitor for the Green Corps contract. I have obtained evidence that this campaign was deliberately orchestrated. She paused. This is the email that proves it. The screen behind her filled with the text. The room absorbed it with the particular silence of people reading something that confirms what they suspected, and a murmur that followed had the quality of collective recognition rather than shock. I want to be precise about what this is, Clara continued. This isn't a story about one man's bad behavior. It's a story about a system that permits the use of prejudice as a competitive tool. When people who don't fit the expected profile of a technology leader begin to succeed at the highest levels, the response, not always, but too often, is to find a way to frame their success as something other than success. As quota, as trend, as exception, as luck. She looked out at the room. Richard Hale's campaign against me is an extreme example of something that operates at lower intensities every single day in this industry. And I am not willing to respond to it in a way that permits it to continue operating quietly. She outlined the legal action they were pursuing. She was clear about what it would and wouldn't accomplish. She was clearer about what she believed needed to happen beyond the legal process, a reckoning with the structural reality that allowed this to be a viable strategy in the first place. The questions came quickly, and she answered each one with the precision of someone who had prepared for this, and also the authority of someone who was speaking from direct personal knowledge of the thing being discussed. When it ended, she sat alone on the stage for a moment while the room emptied around her. She felt emptied herself, not depleted, but cleared of something that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. Jack found her there. That was exactly what it needed to be, he said. He sat down beside her. Now we wait, she said. The response arrived in waves. The initial wave was media coverage that was widespread and, in its majority, serious about what the email revealed. The second wave was the counterattack. Within 24 hours, Hale's communications team had deployed resources that were clearly expensive and carefully aimed. Opinion pieces appeared questioning whether Clara was exploiting the incident for sympathy. Social media filled with the kind of commentary that treats evidence of bias as a claim requiring debate. Hale himself gave an interview in which he described the email as an internal communications document taken out of context. Jack monitored all of it and brought her updates with the steady, worried energy of someone watching a fire that could go either direction. They're gaining some traction, he said one morning. They have more resources for this than we do. That was always going to be true. So what do? We apply pressure to the people who can actually make a decision. Green Corps. The call to David Klein, Green Corps CEO, was the kind of conversation that requires preparation not of words, but of position, of knowing exactly where you stand and what you're willing to say directly. Klein was cautious by temperament, a man who had built his career on the kind of deliberateness that doesn't get easily moved. David, Clara said, after they had worked through the initial layers of professional courtesy, I want to be direct with you. You know what the email shows. You know what this campaign was designed to do. The question isn't whether Thomson Innovations deserves this contract on merit. Our proposal makes that case comprehensively. The question is whether Green Corps wants to be associated with a company that won its position by doing what Richard Hale did. A long pause. Clara, for us this ultimately comes down to performance and results. I know that. And our results are in the proposal you've already reviewed. But this is also a question of what kind of partnership you want to build and with whom. Because the entity that was willing to orchestrate this kind of campaign will bring that same energy to every competitive situation it faces, including ones that involve your reputation. Another silence. I'll take this to the board, Klein said finally, and I'll speak directly with Hale. It wasn't a commitment, but it was movement, and Clara had learned to recognize the value of movement. Then, 10 days after the first leak, the second one arrived. An anonymous source, a different journalist, a longer email chain, this time between Hale and a cluster of other industry executives, documenting not just the campaign against Clara, but a broader practice. The same tactics, deployed against other companies led by women and minorities, coordinated over a period of months with the specific intention of ensuring that a particular demographic of leadership remained marginal in the sector's upper tier. It was systemic, documented, unambiguous. Clara read it 3 times. Then she called her team. The second press conference was more widely attended than the first. The room was fuller, and the cameras were more numerous, and the energy in it had the quality of something that has reached a threshold. Clara presented the new material methodically, allowing its content to do the work rather than editorializing around it. She connected it to the first email, traced a pattern, named what it was. The reaction was immediate and significant. Within 48 hours, the board of Hale's company had convened an emergency meeting. Within 72 hours, Richard Hale had resigned. The PR firm he had engaged issued a public statement. Green Corps released a brief announcement severing any consideration of the competing firm and confirming Thomson Innovations as the leading candidate for the Sustainable Solutions contract. Jack came into her office on a Friday afternoon. Green Corps want to finalize, he said. Clara sat with this for a moment. She didn't move immediately to celebration. She let it arrive fully, felt the weight of everything it had taken to reach this point, felt the relief and the exhaustion, and underneath both of them the clear, clean awareness of something having been right. Good, she said. Let's talk through the terms. It was Jack who finally made her stop. Clara, he said, you won. She looked at him. I know, so let that be what it is for 5 minutes. She smiled. 5 minutes, she agreed. The formal announcement from Green Corps came the following week. The contract was significant in the way that the word billion is always significant. But what Clara found herself thinking about in the days after the announcement was not the financial impact. It was the specific moment during the second press conference when she had looked out at a room full of journalists and felt, for the first time, that the story she was telling was the story that was going to be heard. The celebration at Thomson Innovations was warm and genuine, the kind of gathering that happens when people who have been through something difficult together arrive on the other side of it. Clara moved through the room, feeling the accumulated goodwill of a team that had stayed committed through a period that could have broken them. Jack found her near the window. Against all conceivable odds, he said. Not odds, she said. Obstacles. There's a difference. Odds are random. These obstacles were manufactured, and manufactured things can be taken apart. In the days that followed, while the Green Corps project took shape and Thomson Innovations' team applied itself to the enormous, exciting work of delivering on the promise of the proposal, something else was taking shape in Clara's mind. A question about what the victory was actually for. She had fought and won for herself and for her company. But the system that had permitted Hale's strategy was still operational. The executives named in the second email had faced professional consequences, but the culture that had made them believe this was a viable approach to competition. That culture was older and more diffuse than any individual actor within it. She called her executive team into the conference room on a Tuesday morning and told them what she had been thinking. The Green Corps contract is our immediate priority, and I want us to be clear about that. But I've been thinking about what comes next, not for Thomson Innovation specifically, but for the responsibility we now carry as a company that has this platform. She looked around the table. What happened to us wasn't unusual. It was a particularly visible instance of something that operates quietly at every level of this industry. And we have an opportunity, right now while the world is watching, to do something that uses this moment for more than our own benefit. She proposed a fund. She called it Tech for All, an investment vehicle dedicated to providing capital and mentorship and structural support to startups founded by women, by Black entrepreneurs, by people who were consistently underfunded, not because their ideas were weaker, but because the people making funding decisions were working from a narrow template of what innovation was supposed to look like. Jack listened and then said what she expected him to say, which was that it was a significant additional commitment during a period that was already demanding. "I know," she said. "Tell me what the alternative is." He thought about it. "There isn't one." "No, there isn't." The announcement of Tech for All generated a response that surprised even Clara in its speed and breadth. Within the first week, she heard from entrepreneurs she had never met who described situations that were variations on her own story. Talented, capable people who had been told in 100 different ways that their ideas were welcome, but their presence was conditional. People who had been navigating the same obstacles with less visibility and less resource, and the same fundamental stubbornness. She made time for every one of them that she could. She understood that this was now part of the work. The Tech for All launch event took place 6 months after the Green Core announcement, in a room that was different in quality from the rooms Clara was accustomed to inhabiting at industry events. Fuller, younger, more varied in every visible way. People who were there because they were building things rather than because they were managing their positions. Clara stood at the podium and felt the particular energy of a room full of people who are present because they believe what they're about to hear is actually for them. "Today isn't about me or about Thompson Innovations," she began, her voice finding its steadiness in the familiar way, the way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with conviction. "Today is about all of the people who were never in the room, about ideas that never had the capital to become products, about talent that never had access to the table. We've all felt what it's like to fight just to be heard. Starting today, that fight doesn't have to be solitary." The applause felt different from the applause she was used to. It had the quality of recognition rather than approval. Later, on the building's terrace, the city spread below them in the particular way of cities at night. The lights of it, the movement, the enormous anonymous energy of a place full of people living their lives in every direction. Jack appeared beside her with 2 glasses and handed one over. "We actually did it," he said. Clara looked at the horizon. "We did the first part," she said. "The interesting part is what comes next." He shook his head with the fond exasperation of someone who has known her long enough to expect this. "You genuinely cannot let yourself have a moment." "I can have a moment. I'm having one." She sipped the drink. "But I'm also aware that winning a contract and launching a fund doesn't restructure an industry. The people who were doing what Hale was doing are still in their positions. The ones who weren't caught are still operating. The culture that made it seem like a reasonable approach is still there." She looked at him. "We cracked something open. That's real. Now we have to make sure something grows through the crack." Jack nodded. They stood in the quiet for a while, the city doing what cities do, indifferent and alive. The following months had the quality of a new kind of work. The Green Core project was substantial and demanding, and Clara gave it everything she had, while simultaneously watching Tech for All take its first real steps. The fund had backed 7 startups in its initial quarter, a number that was small in absolute terms and significant in what each of those companies represented. People who had been told the system wasn't built for them building things within it anyway. She received an email from one of the founders Tech for All had funded, a young woman in her mid-20s, building a clean water technology company in a market that traditional investors had passed on because they didn't understand it. The email said, "Before this funding, I had been rejected 43 times. I kept a list. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to see the number clearly. 43 times, and not once did anyone give me a real reason. They just weren't interested. You were the first people who read the actual proposal." Clara read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to her entire team. "This is why we're doing this," she wrote. "Read it." There were days when the resistance was still visible and real, executives at other companies who treated tech for all as a PR strategy rather than a structural commitment, analysts who wrote about the fund with the kind of skepticism that functions as a form of dismissal. Clara addressed all of it, patiently and without losing her position. What she had learned, through everything, was that the work of changing a system is different from the work of succeeding within one. Both require persistence. But changing a system requires accepting that the results arrive slowly and unevenly, and sometimes in forms you didn't expect. She was in her office one afternoon, reviewing the fund's second quarter portfolio, when Jack came in and leaned against the doorframe. "Do you realize what you shifted?" he said. She looked up. "Not just the narrative around you, or around Thompson Innovations. The conversation in this industry is different than it was 18 months ago. The things that used to happen quietly are happening with cameras on them now. People are paying attention in a way they weren't before." Clara sat back. "Because we made them." "Because you made them," he said. "There's a distinction." She thought about this. "It's not enough," she said, "but it's a start. Is it ever enough for you?" She smiled. "Ask me again in 10 years. He laughed and went back to his desk. Clara turned to the window. The city was its usual self outside, enormous and indifferent and full of people making something from what they had. She thought about the woman who had sent the email about 43 rejections. She thought about the girl in Detroit with the leaking roof and the full scholarship that nobody talked about. She thought about Richard Hale and the room full of people who hadn't intervened, and the room full of different people who had stood and applauded when the truth finally came out, and what it meant that both of those rooms had existed in the same industry in the same year. She thought about the work that was still ahead, the companies that needed funding and the founders who needed to be told that the 43rd rejection was not the verdict, the conversations that needed to happen in boardrooms and at conferences and in the smaller, less visible moments where the actual texture of a culture is formed. She turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen. She continued. That was how it worked. Not in moments of triumph, though those arrived. Not in the clean arc of a story with a resolution. In the daily application of the thing you believe to the situation you're in, one day after another, accumulating into something that takes a long time to see clearly, but is being built regardless. Clara Thompson had grown up in a house where the roof let in the rain. She had built something that didn't leak, and now she was making sure the door was open. That was the work. She was not finished with it.